Do you even watch where you're going? Marine Sergeant Jake Mercer violently shoved an unfamiliar woman straight into the concrete wall of the barracks at Camp Pendleton. And in that exact second, the entire hallway went silent. The woman in the dark coat slammed her shoulder against the wall, but she didn't even flinch from the pain. She slowly lifted her eyes toward Jake, while two young Marines nearby suddenly went pale as ghosts. "Sergeant, you just ended your career," she said coldly, before pulling out her credentials. Lieutenant General Sarah Mitchell, Chief Inspector of the United States Marine Corps. Jake felt the air leave his lungs. Just minutes earlier, he had been the toughest instructor on the base, a veteran of 3 deployments in Afghanistan, a man feared by recruits and respected by officers. But after his last mission, he came home a completely different person. His unit had been ambushed in Helmand Province, and 3 of his closest friends burned alive inside an armored vehicle, while Jake desperately tried to force open the jammed doors. Since then, he barely slept, exploded over the smallest things, and drowned everything in whiskey. Command had already considered removing him from service, but because of his combat medals, they gave him one final chance, transferring him as an instructor to San Diego. And on the exact day of a secret inspection, he lost control. The next morning, Jake stood inside the command hall before a disciplinary board while the base commander read his violations one after another. A fight in a bar near Oceanside, aggression toward subordinates, alcohol while on duty, threats against another sergeant. With every word, Jake realized this was the end. But suddenly, General Mitchell interrupted the report. "How many hours do you sleep?" she quietly asked. The entire room fell silent. Jake looked confused. 2, maybe 3. The general stared at his file for several seconds before speaking again. "Your squad held their position for 9 hours without evacuation. You carried 2 wounded Marines under mortar fire. But after you came home, the Corps left you to fight alone." The officers exchanged uneasy glances. Nobody expected that. And at that exact moment, the doors burst open as a terrified corporal ran inside yelling, "Sir, an armed Marine barricaded himself inside the North Barracks. He's carrying a loaded rifle." Everyone immediately jumped to their feet. General Mitchell slowly turned toward Jake and said only one sentence. "Looks like this is your last chance to prove who you really are, Sergeant." Emergency alarms echoed across Camp Pendleton while Marines rushed through the base, locking down the area around the North Barracks. The armed Marine turned out to be 20-year-old Corporal Eric Holloway, a young Marine who had returned from Syria only a month earlier after a failed operation where half his team had been killed. Now he sat inside a barricaded room with a loaded M4 rifle, screaming that nobody was coming near him again. Officers prepared an assault team, snipers took positions on rooftops, and medics waited behind armored vehicles. But then Lieutenant General Sarah Mitchell suddenly ordered everyone to stand down and turned toward Jake Mercer. "You know what's happening inside his head. Go." The officers were stunned. The same man who had shoved a lieutenant general into a wall the day before was now being trusted with the lives of everyone on that base. Jake silently grabbed a vest and walked toward the barracks. As he approached the door, he could hear heavy breathing and broken sentences about explosions and screams coming from inside. "Eric, it's Sergeant Mercer," Jake said calmly. "Stay away from me!" the young Marine screamed as the sound of a rifle butt smashing against the wall echoed through the hallway. But Jake didn't leave. He slowly sat down on the cold floor outside the door and remained silent for several seconds before quietly saying, "I see them at night too. I hear them burning too." Suddenly, everything inside the room went quiet. Jake began telling Eric about Helmand, about the friends he couldn't save, about how everyone back home acted like he was supposed to be normal again. He talked for nearly an hour while armed Marines stood around waiting for the order to storm the room. Then, finally, the lock clicked. The door slowly opened, and a shaking, tearful Eric Holloway stepped outside with his rifle lowered. Jake immediately grabbed him by the shoulders while medics rushed forward. Even the officers looked away because they all understood the truth. Just a few more minutes and the base could have turned into a bloodbath. Later that evening, General Sarah Mitchell personally entered the empty barracks where Jake sat alone and placed his disciplinary file on the table. Then she quietly pulled out a lighter and burned the papers inside a metal bin. Jake stared in disbelief. "You did what half the officers on this base couldn't do," she told him quietly. "But if you ever lose control again, I'll personally throw you out of the Corps." A few months later, Jake Mercer became an instructor in a combat trauma recovery program for veterans in San Diego, and the story about the Marine who shoved a female general into a wall and nearly destroyed his own life continued to spread in whispers through the barracks for years afterward.